Another member of Parliament has come out against a controversial clause in the Liberals' Canada Summer Jobs program. It asks applicants to confirm their core mandate respects reproductive rights, meaning access to abortion. Today's dissenting voice to the plan once again comes from within the Liberal Party. So according to the National Post, Liberal MP John McKay has written a letter saying, "It is my view that applications for government grants that engage in non-political, non-activist work should be free of ideological bias and political preference." So with that, let's hear from our panel. In Toronto, Sean Speer is a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and former advisor to Stephen Harper. Welcome to you. And in Calgary, Zane Velji is vice president at Northweather, a strategy and communications firm. Thank you for joining us from Calgary as well. So, Sean, maybe we will start with you on this point. What do you make of the Liberal MP, John McKay, weighing in, being quite critical, in fact, of this particular clause?
Yeah, I think it's to Mr. McRae's credit. He's, for some time, been a lone voice inside the Liberal ranks, speaking for people of faith, speaking for what may be described as a social conservative perspective. And I think what he's done today, I think, shines light on the kind of inherent contradictions present in the government's posturing on the Canada Summer Jobs program. And some pretty fundamental questions about how to bridge the political divide between secularists and people of faith in this country.
And, you know, Zane, we heard there from Sean that there were some inherent contradictions. Do you agree with that point? What are some of the ones that stood out to you?
Well, what I think is interesting about this program at large is it started with the Liberals wanting to roll out their classic summer jobs program, and now we're having a conversation about the morality clause. And I think, you know, while I do compliment the government for sticking to this conversation and not turtling in, as they have on previous files, this is the last thing that they wanted, was to have a discussion about a potential morality clause in their summer jobs program. I think for them politically right now, what stands out is they've got a choice to make. Is someone like this MP who's spoken out going to be part of a dissenting chorus that they allow within their ranks to show that they are a big tent party? Or are they going to follow the lead of their leader, Justin Trudeau, who's been outrightly vocal on issues, specifically issues, social issues, LGBT issues, and follow his lead and go more to the left on these issues. So this is ultimately the choice that the Liberals have. But the fundamental thesis statement, I would say, is that this is not what they wanted splashed across the news pages as a rollout to their summer jobs program.
I agree with that. Where I would slightly disagree, though, is on the way that they've handled the conversation. The government has, at times, characterized abortion, access to abortion, as a fundamental charter right. And the truth is that's not precisely right. In the 1980s, the Supreme Court ruled that a particular legal framework, that particular prohibitions on abortion access were unconstitutional. The court did not rule that the present scenario, which involves basically unlimited access to abortion, was the only constitutional or charter protected system. And so at times I think the government has purposely obscured the state of jurisprudence on this particular question. The truth is, what they are asking these groups to attest to is not standing up for the charter. It is mostly about affirming support for the government policy or political position. I think that's what Mr. McKay is calling out. And I think he's right to do so.
Well, let me add another angle to that. You know, I think what's important to understand is that while the Liberals are well aware that their stance on this particular issue around LGBT rights broadly, around pro-choice rights broadly, fall in line where the public stands on recent polling, they also need to balance this with the fact that many people do not want to have this conversation openly. And that's the fine line, is that they know that the majority of Canadians probably agree with their viewpoint, but they also know that Canadians do not want to have this conversation. So the Liberals have to have a very fine line to walk here, ensuring that they can stick to their view, ensuring that they can be strong on this issue while ensuring that the conversation does not prolong and become something that tires Canadians out, because we know that they do not, that the large population does not have this appetite for this conversation.
And, you know, to your point about prolonging this discussion and this conversation, do we think, and maybe Sean, I'll go to you with this, do we think that there will be more Liberal MPs, more members of the Liberal Party who will come out being critical of this?
I hope so. If I can just say, one thing I think that this episode has demonstrated is that there's an empathy gap or an empathy deficit in our politics. Folks on the right, of which I'm a part, frequently, I think, lack empathy when we talk about the institutional or systemic barriers that some groups, particularly minorities, face in this country. I think the left has an empathy gap or empathy deficit when it comes to these types of issues. The way that the minister has described the attestation and the expectation of people, how people of faith or organizations with faith-inspired missions ought to be prepared to sign off on, I think signals a kind of basic lack of empathy or understanding or frankly care to understand these organizations and the perspective and the values that they bring. So I think if anything, hopefully this causes both sides of our political divide to focus more on empathy, to try to place ourselves in the other's shoes. I think that's right on this narrow question, but I think it's right more broadly as we deal with questions of social fracture or social fragmentation in our politics and our society.
As a guy who finds himself to the left on issues, let me empathize with Sean's point there. And just to add one more thing, which is that, you know, the organizations in this particular issue that are caught up in the middle are going to be the ones that have the most opportunity to be vocal, right? We immediately have run towards the LGBT and anti-abortion issues, but it's the organizations of faith in the middle. It's the organizations that may have religion rooted within their core principles that are really caught up within this program right here. So I think that's going to be the fine balancing act, is that, you know, the government needs to say that we are, you know, fundamentally forthright on issues related to human rights without alienating organizations of religion and faith.
When we are talking about millions of dollars, which is the case here, I believe more than $200 million towards these summer jobs programs, is it something that these organizations should be entitled to if, as the Liberal government has in their new rules, it could violate some of the charter rights?
Well, if the fundamental question is whether we ought to have a summer jobs program, I'm pleased to have that debate. I think that there are questions about whether it's justified based on, you know, questions of the role of government or market failure or whatever. But if we are going to have the program, then it ought to be available to organizations without the government asking them to in effect, contravene or contradict their own conscience rights or their own freedom of religious views. I think that's where the government has gone off the rails here, and as my colleague says, opened up Pandora's box. The program had been functioning fine. They've provoked this debate. The cynic in me would say that it was purposeful, that it was designed as a cultural wedge. But I think it's just as plausible that they've backed into it, because, as I say, I think there is a case here of a lack of empathy or a lack of understanding of these organizations and the ideas and values that animate them.
Now, let me draw a distinction between the Liberals here, where I think they do not want to be having this conversation versus are organizations entitled to this funding? I'd say absolutely not. I mean, this is where I disagree with Sean. I don't think any organization is entitled to government funding. So if the government wants to have their ideological bent, and you know, yes, this is ideological for them to push this clause, they are entitled to do so, just like previous governments, you know, whether it was the Harper regime or previously, you know, took away funding from organizations that were either, you know, pro-Palestinian or in some cases organizations that weren't necessarily pro-life. So you have, you know, the current situation with the Liberals not wanting to talk about this, but I would draw a very distinct distinction there around entitlement, and I'd say absolutely not. No one's entitled to this funding.
And I very quickly want to get two final points from both of you. Sean, I'll go back to you for it, and then Zane, we'll get you to weigh in as well. If we're trying to broaden out this particular topic, how does it play for voters when an election is coming up on this particular issue? Particularly, we know also that there is the case that has been brought up of whether or not someone who is pro-life can run as a Liberal candidate. So how do we extrapolate this particular point?
Well, I think one of the negative consequences is that increasingly the Liberal Party of Canada is not a party in which people of faith are welcome. And the fact that John McKay is kind of last of the voices like his in the ranks is evidence of that. And I think that's a regrettable outcome. We should want people of various perspectives represented in parties across the spectrum rather than to segregate particular views in one or the other political vehicle. I think that's bad for Canada, that's bad for our politics, and why I think it's essential that we are opening room for these types of conversations for coexistence.
And Zane, same question for you.
Yeah, I mean, listen, in 2015, the Liberals won that last election based on two premises. Number one, going to the left and outflanking the NDP on the left, particularly on social and, frankly, economic issues. And number two, being the party that was at the front of the question, which was, what does it mean to be Canadian? With an answer that said diverse, inclusive, cosmopolitan, meritocratic. And my fear for them is that they're trying to slowly but surely, if Sean is correct, that they're backing into this issue on purpose, they're trying to draw that cultural wedge with last time's playbook. And I think we're living in very different times heading into 2019.
Well, it looks like I am going to leave our discussion there. We've run out of time. Thank you to you both, Sean Speer and Zane Velji. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.